The discovery came in 1867, 12 years after the Oregon gold rush had drawn thousands of desperate men westward in search of fortune. A routine foundation repair at a weathered cabin near Oregon City revealed what local authorities would later describe in official records as disturbing evidence of prolonged human habitation beneath the structure. The cabin belonged to Martha Ellingwood, a widow who had lived alone since her husband's death in 1854. What investigators found beneath the floorboards would challenge everything the surrounding community thought they knew about the woman who had quietly tended her garden and sold preserves at the local market for over a decade. The initial investigation was prompted by structural concerns raised by Peter Fallon, a carpenter hired to reinforce the cabin's foundation. Fallon's written testimony, archived in the Clackamas County records, describes the discovery of hollow spaces and unusual odors emanating from beneath the dwelling. When local authorities excavated the area, they uncovered a network of crude underground chambers, each containing personal belongings that suggested long-term occupancy. 14 distinct sets of possessions were catalogued, including clothing, mining tools, and personal effects that bore the names and markings of men who had been reported missing during the gold rush years. Martha Ellingwood had arrived in Oregon Territory in 1853 with her husband, Thomas Ellingwood, a blacksmith who established a modest operation serving miners, traveling between Portland and the gold fields near Jacksonville. Their cabin sat approximately 3 miles southeast of Oregon City, positioned along a well-traveled route used by prospectors seeking alternative paths to avoid the crowded main roads. The location was strategic, remote enough to offer privacy, yet accessible to travelers who might seek shelter or assistance. Contemporary accounts describe Martha as a reserved woman in her early 30s, known for her skill in preserving foods and her willingness to provide meals to weary travelers for modest compensation. The Ellingwoods' marriage appeared unremarkable to their neighbors. Thomas worked his forge during daylight hours, while Martha managed their household and small garden. Church records from the Oregon City Methodist Episcopal Church show regular attendance by both Thomas and Martha through 1854. The Reverend Samuel Morrison's personal diary, discovered during a church renovation in 1962, contains several references to the couple, describing them as industrious and God-fearing, though the wife maintains an unusual reserve during fellowship gatherings. Thomas Ellingwood's death in late 1854 was attributed to pneumonia, a common affliction during that particularly harsh winter. The attending physician, Dr. William Cascade, noted in his medical journal that Thomas had been ill for several weeks before succumbing to respiratory complications. Martha arranged for a simple burial in the Oregon City Cemetery, and neighbors expected she might return east to family or remarry within a reasonable period. Instead, she chose to remain in the isolated cabin, explaining to concerned community members that she wished to honor her husband's memory by maintaining their homestead. Travelers along the route to the gold fields later reported that the widow had begun offering more extensive services, not merely meals and temporary shelter, but longer-term accommodation for men who claimed to be resting between claims or recovering from mining injuries. Her neighbors, the Hartwell family, who lived approximately 2 miles north, noticed an increase in activity around the Ellingwood property, though they attributed this to Martha's need for additional income following her husband's death. The transition from grieving widow to whatever Martha Ellingwood became began subtly in the spring of 1855. By summer of 1855, local merchants noted that Martha's purchases had increased significantly. She regularly bought quantities of flour, salt pork, and other staples that seemed excessive for a woman living alone. When questioned, she explained that she was providing meals for travelers and wanted to ensure adequate supplies. Store owner James Mitchell recorded in his ledger that Martha always paid in gold dust or small nuggets, which supported her explanation about serving minors. The source of her payment method never raised suspicion, as many residents received gold dust in exchange for goods and services during this period. What the community failed to observe was the systematic disappearance of men who had stayed at Martha's cabin. These were not prominent citizens or family men whose absence would be immediately noticed. They were drifters, failed prospectors, men running from debts or past crimes, individuals whose disappearance might be attributed to any number of common frontier circumstances. Some were known to have spoken of moving on to California goldfields, others had mentioned returning east. A few had hinted at trouble with claim jumpers or creditors. Their absence from the community was unremarkable in a time when men frequently vanished from the frontier without explanation. The pattern of disappearances followed a consistent timeline that would later become clear through careful examination of missing person reports filed with various territorial authorities. Men would arrive at Martha's cabin, typically in the evening hours when other accommodation options were limited. Neighbors occasionally observed lantern light burning unusually late into the night, but this was explained as Martha providing care for sick or injured travelers. The men would be seen around the property for periods ranging from several days to a few weeks, often helping with minor repairs or agricultural work in exchange for room and board. Then they would simply be gone, with Martha explaining to any inquirer that they had decided to move on to new opportunities. The underground chambers discovered by Peter Fallon revealed the true fate of these missing men. Each space was approximately 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, carved directly into the earth beneath the cabin's foundation. The chambers were crude but functional, equipped with minimal ventilation through gaps in the floorboards above. Personal effects found in each space suggested prolonged occupancy, worn blankets, eating utensils, and personal items that indicated the inhabitants had expected temporary accommodation, not permanent confinement. Most disturbing were the scratch marks found on the wooden supports, suggesting desperate attempts to escape from these underground prisons. Investigation of Martha's financial records revealed a systematic pattern of profit from her captive's circumstances. Bank records from Oregon City showed regular deposits of gold dust and nuggets throughout 1855 and 1856. The amounts corresponded closely with the known wealth of several missing men, including prospector Samuel Chen, who had reportedly struck a modest claim near Ashland before disappearing, and merchant William Torres, who carried significant capital for purchasing mining equipment. Martha's standard explanation that she accepted payment from grateful travelers had concealed a methodical theft of her victims' assets. The physical evidence suggested that Martha had perfected her system over time. Early chambers showed crude construction and poor planning, while later excavations revealed improved ventilation and more sophisticated security measures. Investigators theorized that she had learned from mistakes that resulted in premature deaths among her initial victims. Later, chambers contained evidence of longer occupancy, indicating that Martha had developed methods to keep men alive for extended periods while systematically depleting their resources. Testimony from surviving community members who were interviewed during the investigation revealed retrospective warning signs that had been overlooked or misinterpreted. Neighbor Sarah Hartwell recalled that Martha had sometimes seemed unusually knowledgeable about mining techniques and gold processing for a blacksmith's widow. Store clerk David Palmer remembered Martha asking specific questions about preserving meat and storing large quantities of food, requests that had seemed prudent for someone serving travelers, but took on sinister implications in light of the discovery. Most notably, several residents recalled hearing what they had assumed were coyotes or other animals calling from the direction of Martha's property during evening hours, sounds that investigators later realized may have been human cries for help. The investigation into Martha Ellingwood's activities concluded in 1868 with the filing of a comprehensive report by Territorial Marshal Edward Fleming. The document, archived in the Oregon State Historical Society, details the discovery of remains in a wooded area approximately half a mile from the cabin, where Martha had apparently disposed of victims who had died in captivity. Forensic examination, primitive by modern standards but thorough for its time, identified bone fragments and personal effects belonging to at least 11 individuals. 3 men remained unaccounted for, leading investigators to theorize that either their remains had been more completely destroyed or they had somehow escaped Martha's captivity and chosen not to report their experiences. Martha Ellingwood herself was never brought to trial. On the morning investigators arrived to arrest her in connection with the discoveries, they found her cabin empty. Local authorities launched an extensive search, but Martha had vanished as completely as her victims. Her disappearance sparked numerous theories and reported sightings throughout the Pacific Northwest, but none were confirmed. Some believed she had fled to California or returned east under an assumed name. Others suspected she had met her end in the wilderness while attempting to escape justice. A few community members whispered that she might have continued her predatory activities elsewhere, preying on vulnerable men in other frontier settlements where her methods would go undetected. The case officially remained open until 1872, when territorial authorities declared Martha Ellingwood presumed deceased. By that time, the Oregon Gold Rush had ended, and the attention of law enforcement had shifted to other frontier challenges. The cabin itself was destroyed by fire in 1871, officially attributed to lightning, but privately suspected by some residents to be arson by community members who wished to erase the disturbing memories associated with the property. The land was eventually sold to developers and subdivided, with no marker indicating its dark history. Documentation of the Martha Ellingwood case was archived and largely forgotten until 1963, when graduate student Rebecca Morrison discovered the files while researching frontier crime for her thesis at Portland State University. Morrison's work brought renewed attention to the case and prompted examination of similar disappearances during the Gold Rush period. Her research suggested that Martha Ellingwood's activities were not unique, and that the chaos and mobility of frontier life had provided perfect cover for predatory individuals who targeted vulnerable populations. The psychological profile that emerges from examination of Martha's methods suggests a calculating individual who exploited the desperation and isolation common among Gold Rush participants. Her victims were chosen specifically because they were unlikely to be missed immediately, and her location provided both access to potential targets and privacy for her activities. The progression from opportunistic theft to systematic imprisonment indicates an escalating pattern of behavior that might have continued indefinitely had structural repairs not revealed her underground chambers. Modern criminologists who have studied the Martha Ellingwood case note similarities to other instances of what would now be classified as serial predatory behavior. The combination of financial motivation and apparent psychological satisfaction derived from controlling her victims represents a complex criminal pathology that was poorly understood in the 1860s. Martha's ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic predation demonstrates sophisticated social manipulation skills that allowed her to operate undetected for over 2 years. The impact of Martha Ellingwood's crimes extended beyond the immediate victims and their families. The revelation that such systematic predation had occurred undetected shook confidence in community safety and highlighted vulnerabilities in frontier law enforcement. The case prompted changes in how territorial authorities tracked missing persons and investigated suspicious circumstances, though these improvements came too late to prevent Martha's crimes or aid in her capture. Records indicate that at least 3 families received confirmation of relatives' fates through the investigation, providing closure after years of uncertainty about missing loved ones. For others, the discovery raised painful questions without providing definitive answers. The incomplete nature of the evidence meant that some families never learned the specific circumstances of their relatives' deaths, or recovered personal effects that might have provided comfort or closure. The financial investigation revealed that Martha had accumulated substantial wealth through her crimes, converting stolen gold into bank deposits and land investments throughout the Oregon Territory. When her assets were liquidated following her disappearance, the proceeds were distributed among identified victims' families, though this compensation could hardly address the emotional trauma of learning how their loved ones had died. The process of identifying rightful heirs and distributing restitution continued for several years after the initial investigation concluded. Contemporary accounts of the discovery and subsequent investigation reveal the profound impact on the local community. Church records show increased attendance and longer prayer services in the months following the revelation, suggesting that residents sought spiritual comfort in processing the knowledge that such evil had operated undetected in their midst. Several families relocated from the area, unwilling to remain near the site of such systematic cruelty. Others reported difficulty sleeping and persistent anxiety about the safety of travelers and vulnerable community members. The Martha Ellingwood case became a cautionary tale that was passed down through oral tradition in the Oregon Territory for generations. Parents warned children about the dangers of trusting strangers, and community members developed informal networks for tracking the movements of travelers and ensuring that vulnerable individuals did not vanish without notice. These changes represented a loss of innocence for a frontier community that had previously operated on assumptions of basic human decency and mutual assistance among settlers. Historical analysis of the case reveals broader patterns of exploitation that characterized frontier life during the gold rush period. Martha Ellingwood's crimes represented an extreme example of how individuals could exploit the chaos and desperation of rapid westward expansion for personal gain. Her ability to operate undetected highlighted systematic vulnerabilities in law enforcement and community oversight that persisted until more organized territorial governments were established in the 1870s. The documentation preserved from the Martha Ellingwood investigation provides valuable insight into frontier criminal justice procedures and investigative techniques of the 1860s. Marshall Fleming's reports demonstrate both the limitations and the dedication of territorial law enforcement officers working with minimal resources and training. The thoroughness of the investigation, despite its technological limitations, reflects a commitment to justice that helped establish precedents for handling complex criminal cases in frontier communities. Evidence suggests that Martha Ellingwood's psychological development may have been influenced by the extreme isolation and hardship of frontier life. Interviews with neighbors who had known her before her husband's death described a woman who seemed overwhelmed by the challenges of frontier existence, but determined to maintain her independence. The transformation from struggling widow to systematic predator represents a psychological deterioration that may have been precipitated by the stress and desperation of her circumstances, though this does not excuse the calculated cruelty of her actions. The underground chambers themselves represented a significant engineering undertaking that Martha had completed largely without assistance. The excavation and construction required substantial physical labor and technical knowledge that surprised investigators who had known her only as a mild-mannered widow. The sophistication of her later chamber designs suggested that she had developed expertise in construction and ventilation through trial and error, learning from the failures that had resulted in early victim deaths and improving her methods over time. Financial analysis of Martha's activities revealed that she had generated substantial income, not only from stealing her victims' gold, but also from selling their mining equipment and personal belongings to unsuspecting merchants in distant communities. She had established a network of trading relationships that allowed her to dispose of evidence while generating additional profit from her crimes. This aspect of her operation demonstrated business acumen that contributed to her ability to avoid detection and maintain the appearance of legitimate prosperity. The search for Martha Ellingwood continued sporadically for decades after her disappearance, with reported sightings and alleged encounters documented in law enforcement files throughout the Western Territories. Most of these reports proved to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking by individuals hoping to claim rewards offered for information about her whereabouts. However, the persistent nature of these reports reflected the community's desire for resolution and closure that never materialized. Modern forensic analysis of evidence preserved from the crime scene has provided additional insights into Martha's methods and the suffering of her victims. Bone analysis conducted in the 1950s revealed evidence of malnutrition and physical restraint that confirmed investigators' theories about prolonged captivity. Tool marks on wooden artifacts suggested that victims had made repeated attempts to escape, indicating periods of consciousness and hope that made their eventual deaths more tragic. The psychological profile of Martha Ellingwood's victims reveals patterns common among gold rush participants: men separated from family support systems, individuals pursuing high-risk ventures with uncertain outcomes, and people whose movements were irregular and difficult to track. These characteristics made them ideal targets for predatory individuals who understood how to exploit frontier social dynamics. Martha's selection criteria demonstrated sophisticated understanding of which individuals could disappear without triggering immediate searches or investigations. Community responses to the revelation of Martha's crimes included efforts to memorialize her victims and prevent similar tragedies in the future. A memorial service was held at the Oregon City Methodist Episcopal Church in 1868, attended by family members who had traveled from distant locations to honor their lost relatives. The service was described in contemporary accounts as both a celebration of the victims' lives and a solemn recognition of the evil that had destroyed them. The legal precedents established by the Martha Ellingwood investigation influenced how territorial and later state authorities approached cases involving missing persons and suspected foul play. The systematic documentation of evidence and witness testimony established standards for criminal investigations that were adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest. These procedural improvements helped ensure that future crimes would be investigated more thoroughly and prosecuted more effectively. Legacy effects of Martha Ellingwood's crimes persisted in the Oregon Territory for decades after her disappearance. Travelers became more cautious about accepting accommodation from strangers, and communities developed informal networks for monitoring the safety of vulnerable individuals. These changes represented both positive adaptations that improved community safety and negative effects that reduced the spirit of mutual assistance that had previously characterized frontier life. The economic impact of Martha's crimes extended beyond the direct theft of her victims' assets. The revelation of her activities damaged confidence in frontier hospitality and commerce, leading to increased security measures and verification procedures that raised costs for legitimate businesses. These effects were particularly pronounced in industries that served transient populations, as merchants and service providers faced greater scrutiny from customers who had lost trust in frontier commerce. Archaeological investigation of the Ellingwood property in the 1950s revealed additional evidence of Martha's activities, including remnants of her underground construction and artifacts that had been overlooked during the original investigation. These discoveries confirmed investigators' theories about the scope and duration of her crimes, while providing additional details about her methods and the suffering of her victims. The archaeological evidence also revealed that Martha had continued modifying and expanding her underground chambers until shortly before her disappearance, suggesting that she had intended to continue her predatory activities indefinitely. The Martha Ellingwood case has been studied by criminologists and historians as an example of how extreme circumstances can reveal hidden aspects of human nature. Her transformation from grieving widow to calculating predator represents a psychological deterioration that was facilitated by the isolation and lawlessness of frontier life. The case demonstrates how individuals with predatory tendencies could exploit frontier conditions to pursue criminal activities on a scale that would have been impossible in more organized communities. Documentation preserved from the investigation includes detailed inventories of personal effects found in each underground chamber, providing poignant insights into the lives and hopes of Martha's victims. These artifacts included letters from family members, mining claims documentation, photographs, and personal mementos that revealed the humanity of individuals who had been reduced to names in investigation reports. The preservation of these items allowed families to recover something of their lost relatives while providing investigators with evidence of Martha's systematic approach to her crimes. The social dynamics that enabled Martha Ellingwood's crimes reflected broader patterns of frontier life that prioritized individual independence over community oversight. The cultural emphasis on personal freedom and minimal government interference created conditions where predatory individuals could operate with relative impunity. Martha's case demonstrated the dark side of frontier individualism and highlighted the need for community structures that balanced personal liberty with collective safety. Religious and philosophical responses to the Martha Ellingwood case reflected the challenge of reconciling faith and moral certainty with evidence of systematic evil operating within the community. Church records and personal diaries from the period document struggles to understand how such cruelty could exist undetected among God-fearing people. These spiritual crises prompted deeper examination of Christian duty and community responsibility that influenced religious practice in the Oregon Territory for years after the crimes were discovered. The investigation files preserved in territorial archives document the personal toll that the case took on law enforcement officers and community members who participated in the investigation. Marshall Fleming's personal correspondence reveals his struggle to understand the psychological motivations behind Martha's crimes and his frustration at being unable to bring her to justice. These documents provide insight into the emotional challenges faced by frontier law enforcement officers dealing with crimes that exceeded their training and experience. Historical analysis of similar cases during the Gold Rush period suggests that Martha Ellingwood's crimes may not have been as unique as initially believed. Records from California and other Gold Rush territories document similar patterns of missing persons and suspected predatory behavior, though few cases were investigated as thoroughly as Martha's crimes. This broader pattern indicates that frontier conditions created opportunities for systematic predation that were exploited by multiple individuals throughout the Western Territories. The preservation of evidence from the Martha Ellingwood case in territorial and later state archives has provided valuable resources for researchers studying frontier crime and law enforcement. The detailed documentation created by investigating officers represents one of the most complete criminal case files from the Oregon territorial period, offering insights into investigative procedures, community responses, and legal frameworks that characterized frontier justice. These materials continue to be studied by historians and criminologists seeking to understand the social dynamics of westward expansion. After more than 150 years, the case of Martha Ellingwood remains one of Oregon's most disturbing, unsolved mysteries. The 14 men who disappeared beneath her cabin represent more than statistics in a criminal investigation. They were individuals with families, dreams, and futures that were cut short by one woman's calculated cruelty. Their names, preserved in investigation files and memorial records, serve as reminders of both human vulnerability and the capacity for evil that can exist beneath the surface of ordinary communities. The sounds that once echoed from beneath that cabin near Oregon City have long since faded, but the questions they raised about trust, community, and human nature continue to resonate in the quiet spaces where history remembers what civilization prefers to forget.